The clink of silverware sounded louder than it should have, sharp against the low hum of the dishwasher and the steady ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall. We were sitting around the table like any other night, plates half full. Polite smiles stretched thin. Claire leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her mouth curled into a small, knowing smirk. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "If you're so smart," she said lightly, almost amused, "then pay your own bills." The words landed and stayed there, heavy in the air. Mark didn't look up. He didn't laugh it off or tell her to stop. He just kept eating, his silence settling beside her like agreement. For a moment, no one spoke. I felt something shift inside me, not sharply, not like anger, but like a quiet door closing. I looked at the table. At the plates I had paid for, the lights I had kept on the roof, I had helped hold over all our heads. Claire's smile didn't fade. Mark's eyes stayed fixed on his food. In that moment, I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. I wasn't family anymore. I was an expense they had grown comfortable mocking. They had no idea how fragile their world really was. And they had no idea that my silence, the same as silence they mistook for weakness, was the only thing keeping everything from falling apart. After dinner, I excused myself without saying much. I carried my plate to the sink, rinsed it clean, and set it carefully in the rack like I always did. The house moved on around me. Claire's laughter floated in from the living room. Mark's voice followed, easy, relaxed, as if nothing had happened. That hurt more than the words themselves. The insult had been sharp, but the indifference was what cut deep. I went to the small guest room that had been mine since Eleanor passed. The room was tidy, almost impersonal. A bed, a dresser, a lamp by the window. It had never truly felt like my space, more like a place I was allowed to occupy, as long as I stayed useful and quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the evening replay in my mind. Not just Claire's words, but the way Mark hadn't stepped in. The way no one had felt the need to check on me. I was 70 years old then, a retired civil engineer who had spent decades building roads and bridges across this state. I had overseen projects that carried thousands of people every day, structures designed to hold weight without complaint. When Eleanor was alive, we talked about retirement as a gentle winding down. Travel. Gardening. A slower pace. Instead, I buried her and moved into my son's house, telling myself that family was what mattered now. That being close was worth the adjustment. I believed respect would come naturally. I believed love didn't need to be negotiated. At first, things were fine. Mark seemed grateful to have me there. Claire was polite, even warm. When small issues came up, I handled them without fuss. A tax notice here, an insurance renewal there. I had always been good with details, with planning ahead. It felt natural to keep things running smoothly. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't ask for thanks. I told myself that this was what fathers did. Over time, though, I noticed how invisible my role had become. Bills were paid on time, so no one thought about who paid them. Repairs were handled before they turned into emergencies, so no one saw the effort. When the roof needed work, I coordinated it quietly. When Claire's car loan threatened to balloon, I stepped in and made adjustments. Their life stayed comfortable, predictable, and calm. And I let myself believe that meant I was needed. But need is a dangerous thing to confuse with respect. That night, sitting alone in my room, I realized the comment at dinner hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of assumptions piling up, of my help being absorbed into the background until it felt like an entitlement. Claire hadn't insulted me in a moment of anger. She had spoken from a place of certainty. She believed I had no choice. What unsettled me most was Mark's silence. I had raised him to be kind, to stand up when something was wrong. I remembered teaching him how to ride a bike, running behind him, with my hands hovering near the seat, ready to catch him if he fell. I remembered stepping in when teachers misunderstood him, when bosses treated him unfairly. I had absorbed consequences, so he wouldn't have to. And now when it mattered most, he had looked away. That realization settled slowly like dust after a collapse you don't hear right away. I began to see the small signs I had ignored. How conversations about money happened around me, not with me. How Claire referred to decisions as already made. How Mark deferred to her with a tired acceptance that felt practiced. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Anger didn't come. Not yet. What came instead was a strange calm, the kind that follows a hard truth finally being acknowledged. I understood then that nothing I said would change what had already shifted. Confrontation would only invite excuses, promises temporary adjustments. It would pull me back into the role of stabilizer, the quiet fixer who made discomfort disappear. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. What would happen if I stopped? The idea scared me more than I expected. Not because I worried about myself, but because I had been conditioned to believe that everything would collapse without me. That stepping back would be selfish. That my worth was tied to how much I could carry without complaint. Eleanor used to warn me about that. She said I mistook endurance for virtue. I brushed it off, then smiling telling her I was just doing my part. I reached for the photo on my nightstand, the one of us taken years ago on a windy afternoon near the coast. She was laughing, her hair pulled back, her eyes sharp and kind. I wondered what she would have said if she had been at that table tonight. I suspected she wouldn't have been silent, and I suspected she wouldn't have wanted me to be either. Down the hall, the television volume rose, then fell. The house was settling into sleep. I listened to the sounds I had grown used to, and felt something firm take shape inside me. This wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about acknowledging that I had allowed myself to be reduced to a function. I sat up and looked around the room again. There was very little in it that truly belonged to me. That felt symbolic, though I didn't have the words for it yet. All I knew was that staying would mean accepting what had been said, accepting the role they had assigned me. Leaving, on the other hand, would mean stepping into uncertainty. I didn't make any dramatic plans that night. I didn't pack a bag or leave a note. I simply lay there, awake, listening to the house breathe, and let the certainty settle. Something had ended at that dinner table, whether they realized it or not. And something else quieter and far more dangerous to their sense of control had just begun. The morning after the dinner felt strangely normal, and that was what unsettled me most. Sunlight slipped out through the kitchen blinds, catching dust in the air. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed the way it always did. Claire moved around the counter, tapping on her phone, already absorbed in her day. Mark kissed her cheek, grabbed his keys, and spoke to me as if nothing had happened. His voice polite, almost careful. No apology came. No acknowledgement. The moment from the night before had already been filed away, labeled insignificant, dismissed as resolved, simply because it hadn't been challenged. I sat at the table and watched them move through their routine, and something older than that one comment began to rise in me. The hurt hadn't come from the words themselves. It came from the confirmation. From realizing that what Claire said was possible only because of everything that had come before it. For years I had been the invisible foundation of that house. I didn't think of it that way at first. I thought of it as being helpful, as being prepared. When the property tax notices arrived each year, they came to me. I paid them automatically the way I had paid bills my entire adult life. When the homeowner's insurance renewed, I reviewed the policy, adjusted coverage, handled the paperwork. No one asked me to do it. No one thanked me for it. It simply happened quietly, efficiently, without disruption. That was how I liked it. Or at least, that was what I told myself. When the furnace began making a noise that suggested it wouldn't survive another winter, I called a technician before anyone else noticed. When the plumber warned that the pipes were aging poorly, I scheduled preventative work instead of waiting for a flood. These weren't grand gestures. They were small acts of maintenance, the kind that prevent panic, the kind that make life feel stable. Stability I learned is often mistaken for permanence. The first time I helped with Claire's car, it felt temporary. She had been stressed, worried about a loan she couldn't quite manage on her own. I reviewed the terms, saw the problem immediately, and adjusted things quietly. I didn't lecture her. I didn't bring it up again. The payments came out of an account she never looked at closely. The car stayed in the driveway. Life moved on. Then there was the school. When my grandchild's tuition increased, it was framed as a short-term issue, just until bonuses came through, just until things leveled out. I absorbed the increase without comment, telling myself that education was never a bad investment. I watched the calendar planned ahead, shifted funds accordingly. Every time a new expense appeared, I heard the same phrase: "We'll figure it out." What they meant was that I already had. The house itself was the biggest illusion of all. Mark and Claire believed it was theirs in the way people believe the ground beneath their feet will always hold. They didn't see the cracks. I monitored the calculations. I ran in my head the long-term planning that kept the place from becoming a liability instead of a home. My engineering mind never really shut off. I noticed load-bearing issues, drainage problems, the subtle signs of wear that come from time and neglect. I addressed them before they became visible. That was my mistake. Because when something never breaks, people forget it can. Claire talked about money the way someone talks about air. As if it simply existed, as if it flowed naturally, endlessly. She referred to decisions as already handled, to plans as taken care of. Sometimes she would smile and say, "We're lucky," and I would nod, knowing how much effort that luck required. Mark, on the other hand, benefited from my presence in a quieter way. He delegated stress upward without meaning to. When things went wrong, he assumed I would notice. When things went right, he didn't question why. I had spent his entire life solving problems before they reached him. I had protected him from consequences when he was young, stepped in when he struggled, smoothed paths that might have forced him to grow uncomfortable. I had made it easy for him to stay a son instead of becoming a man who stood fully on his own. That realization stung more than I expected. It meant I wasn't just a victim of what had happened. I was part of the system that allowed it to exist. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat by the window, watching the street come to life. Neighbors leaving for work, children waiting for the bus, ordinary scenes that felt oddly distant. Claire passed behind me without looking up, already deep into a conversation on her phone. She spoke about schedules, about plans for the weekend, about money, as if it were a given, not a responsibility. At one point she laughed and said Dad's got it, referring to something I hadn't even heard discussed yet. She said it casually, confidently. That was when I understood how complete the shift had become. I wasn't consulted. I was assumed. My role had been reduced to a guarantee, a safety net so reliable that it no longer registered as human effort. And yet I never spoke up. I told myself I didn't want to create tension. I told myself that family harmony was worth more than recognition. I told myself that complaining would make me sound ungrateful for the roof over my head, for the chance to be close to my grandchild. Deep down, there was another fear I didn't like to name. I was afraid that if I stopped being useful, I would stop being welcome. I had grown up in a generation that measured worth through endurance. You carried what needed carrying. You didn't announce it. You didn't ask for applause. Silence was dignity. Sacrifice was assumed. Those values had served me well in my career. Bridges don't need praise. They just need to hold. But families are not structures. They are relationships. And relationships rot when contribution is replaced by entitlement. That afternoon, I sorted through paperwork in my room, something I had done countless times before. Statements, notices, renewals. Each piece of paper represented another quiet act of maintenance, another unseen choice. I realized as I flipped through them that every one of those systems had a single point of failure. Me. The thought sent a chill through me. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood the truth of my position. Everything they relied on, every comfort they enjoyed, without question, flowed from a source they no longer respected. I imagined briefly what would happen if that source dried up. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a missed payment here, a delayed response there. The kind of cracks you don't notice until they widen. For the first time, I didn't rush to dismiss the idea. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back in their folders. Outside, a car door slammed. Mark's engine started. Claire's voice floated down the hallway, still talking, still confident. The house felt solid, unshakable. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my hands that had built things meant to last. I wondered what I had built here and whether it was worth preserving at the cost of my own dignity. By the end of that day, I understood something clearly. What I had been calling support had slowly turned into permission. And permission, once given freely and without limits, is rarely returned with gratitude. I didn't know yet what I would do with that understanding. I only knew that the foundation they trusted so completely had begun to question whether it should keep carrying the weight at all. The morning after that dinner began like any other, and that was what made it unbearable. The kitchen smelled of toast and coffee. The radio murmured low news updates no one was really listening to. Claire moved around the counter in her robe, hair pulled back, already irritated at something on her phone. Mark came in a few minutes later, tying his shoes, glancing at the clock. "Morning, Dad," he said, his voice neutral, almost formal. I nodded back. That was it. No pause, no awkwardness, no attempt to circle back to what had been said the night before. The insult had been absorbed into the walls, treated like background noise. Claire spoke to Mark about her schedule as if I weren't there. She mentioned an appointment, complained about traffic, asked if he could pick something up later. Mark answered easily. They were a practiced unit, moving around me the way water moves around a rock. I waited for something. An apology. A glance. A quiet word when Claire stepped out of the room. It never came. Mark poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. I watched his face, the same face I had memorized when he was a boy, searching for signs of discomfort or regret. There was none. Just focused distraction and a careful avoidance of my eyes. That was when I understood that Claire's words hadn't been a mistake. They had been a test, and Mark had passed it by staying silent. Silence, I realized, is not neutral. It is a decision. After Mark left for work, the house grew quieter. Claire grabbed her bag and announced she'd be back late. She didn't ask if I needed anything. She didn't say goodbye. The door closed behind her, and the quiet that followed felt different than before, heavier, charged with something unresolved. I sat alone at the kitchen table long after they were gone. My coffee went cold. The radio clicked off automatically. In the stillness, memories surfaced uninvited, and with them came a clarity that was both painful and strangely relieving. I remembered Mark at 17 standing in the principal's office, shoulders, tense eyes darting between the adults in the room. He had messed up. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, but enough to threaten his future if handled poorly. I had stepped in without hesitation, speaking calmly, taking responsibility where I could, redirecting blame away from him. I had driven him home afterward in silence, then sat with him on the porch and told him that mistakes didn't define him, but how he handled them would. He had nodded, grateful, relieved. He had learned something that day, though not what I intended. I remembered another time years later when his first job fell apart. He came to me embarrassed, angry, unsure of himself. I listened. I offered advice. I helped him bridge the gap until he found something new. I made it easy for him to recover without really feeling the fall. I had done this over and over, in ways large and small. Every time I softened a consequence, every time I absorbed discomfort meant for him, I taught him that silence was an option, that someone else would step in, that someone had always been me. Now, sitting alone in the quiet kitchen, I felt the weight of that realization settle in. Mark hadn't defended me because he didn't know how. He had learned that staying quiet kept things smooth. He had learned that discomfort passed if ignored long enough. Claire understood this instinctively. I saw it in the way she spoke, the way she asserted herself without raising her voice. She didn't need Mark to agree out loud. His silence was enough. Over the next few days, I noticed the pattern everywhere. At dinner, Claire spoke freely, confidently, making decisions that affected all of us without looking my way. Mark nodded along occasionally, glancing at me only when he thought I might object. I didn't. Not because I agreed, but because I was watching. One evening, Claire discussed a financial decision at the table, mentioning that she'd moved some money around to cover something unexpected. She spoke as if it were a minor detail, a footnote in her day. Mark asked a question, half-hearted, and she brushed it off with a smile. "It's handled," she said. No big deal. Neither of them asked how. Neither of them considered that the reason it always felt handled was because I had been quietly handling things for years. As she spoke, I felt something inside me go still. Not numb, not angry, just clear. I saw my role with painful precision. I was no longer a father whose experience mattered. I was a utility, a background function, something you notice only when it stops working. That night, I lay awake in my room listening to the house settle. Pipes clicked softly as they cooled. A floorboard creaked somewhere down the hall. Familiar sounds that once meant comfort now felt like reminders of how deeply embedded I had become in a life that no longer saw me. I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. What if I hadn't stepped in all those times? What if Mark had been forced to face discomfort, to make hard choices, to speak up when it mattered? Would he have found his voice then? Would he have found it now? The answer came quietly, without judgment. It didn't matter anymore. The next morning, I passed Mark in the hallway as he rushed out the door. He paused just for a second, as if considering something. My heart lifted despite myself. Then his phone buzzed and he glanced down, distracted. The moment passed. "See you later, Dad," he said, already turning away. I watched him leave and felt the final piece fall into place. My presence had become optional, my voice unnecessary, my dignity negotiable. Claire grew more comfortable as the days went on. She corrected me openly. She dismissed suggestions with a laugh. Once, when I mentioned a concern about an upcoming bill, she waved it away and said, "It's fine, we'll deal with it." The way she said we excluded me entirely. I began to understand that the loss I felt wasn't just about respect. It was about identity. I had spent my life being someone others relied on, someone whose judgment carried weight. In that house, I had slowly become something else entirely. A safety net mistaken for furniture. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in my room, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Older, thinner, quieter than the man I remembered being. I realized then that staying silent any longer wouldn't preserve peace. It would erase me. And yet, I didn't confront them. Not because I was afraid, but because I saw finally that confrontation would change nothing. Words would be absorbed, promises made, behavior adjusted just enough to keep me in place. I didn't want apologies. I didn't want recognition belatedly offered out of fear. I wanted my life back. That evening, as I sat alone with the light off the house glowing softly around me, a new thought settled in. Clear, unavoidable. If silence had been used to diminish me, then perhaps silence chosen deliberately could do something else entirely. For the first time, I didn't think about explaining myself. I thought about absence. And instead of fear, the idea brought an unexpected sense of steadiness. Something in me had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. The man who waited for permission was gone, and the man who remained was beginning to understand exactly what he needed to do next. The house was quiet in a way it never was during the day. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum more softly, as if it sensed the stillness and chose not to disturb it. The hallway lights were dim, casting long shadows across the floor. Somewhere down the hall, a clock ticked steadily, marking time without urgency or emotion. I stood in my doorway and listened not for voices, but for confirmation. Everyone was asleep. The house had settled around them, secure in the assumption that everything was still being held together. I felt no rush, no spike of anger, just a calm resolve that surprised me with its steadiness. I knew with a certainty that had been forming for days that staying one more night would make leaving harder. Staying would turn clarity into doubt. So I didn't hesitate. I didn't announce what I was doing. There was no confrontation waiting to happen, no final speech prepared in my head. I had already learned that explanations invited debate, and debate invited erosion. The decision needed to stand on its own, untouched by negotiation. I moved quietly through the room, opening drawers, closing them again. I took only what mattered. My wallet, my identification, a folder with documents I had organized years ago and never thought I'd need so suddenly. I pulled a single change of clothes from the closet and folded them neatly, the way Eleanor used to tease me for doing even when packing in a hurry. From the dresser, I picked up the framed photograph of Eleanor and me, standing near the coast wind, whipping her hair into her face. She had been laughing at something I'd said. Her eyes bright, her hand gripping my arm like she always did when she was amused. I hesitated for a moment, then tucked the frame carefully into my bag. Everything else stayed. I didn't take furniture. I didn't take tools. I didn't take the small comforts that had accumulated over years of living quietly in someone else's home. I left behind the things that tied me to obligation, to routines that no longer served me. What I carried was light, deliberate, and unmistakably mine. Before leaving the room, I paused and looked around one last time. The bed was made. The lamp was off. The space looked unchanged, as if I might return later and pick up where I left off. I knew I wouldn't. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind me gently. The carpet muffled my footsteps as I walked toward the living room. Family photos lined the walls, moments captured and frozen in time. Birthdays, holidays, smiling faces. I studied them as I passed, not with bitterness, but with a strange sense of completion. At the door to my grandchild's room, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, a soft nightlight casting a faint glow across the floor. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. Love doesn't require intrusion, and this moment wasn't about reassurance. It was about restraint. In the living room, everything was exactly where it should be. The couch cushions arranged neatly. Claire's throw blanket draped over the arm. Mark's shoes by the door. The television dark and reflective, mirroring my own tired face back at me. I stood there for a moment and acknowledged something that felt important. I had already said goodbye long before this night. The leaving had begun the moment I understood my place in that house. Tonight was just the physical expression of it. At the front door, my hand rested on the knob. It felt cool beneath my palm. I turned it slowly, listening to the quiet click of the lock disengaging. I didn't slam the door behind me. I didn't lock it again. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. This wasn't punishment. It was withdrawal. Outside, the night air was crisp and steady, grounding in a way the house no longer was. Streetlights cast pools of pale yellow across the sidewalk. The neighborhood looked unchanged, peaceful, oblivious. I took a step away from the house and felt something loosen in my chest, something I hadn't realized was clenched. I didn't look back. The drive was short. I had arranged a temporary place earlier that day, telling myself it was just a precaution, just an option. Now, it was a destination. The roads were empty, the radio off. I drove in silence, letting the quiet settle around me, not as loneliness, but as space. When I arrived, I carried my bag inside and set it down by the door. The place was small, clean, anonymous. Exactly what I needed. I sat on the edge of the bed and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day finally press in. Even then, there was no regret, only a faint ache where familiarity used to be. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was uninterrupted. The next morning, I woke early out of habit. Sunlight streamed through unfamiliar curtains. For a brief moment, I reached instinctively for the worries I usually carried, the mental checklist of things that needed attention. Then I remembered. The list wasn't mine anymore. I made coffee and drank it slowly, standing by the window. The world moved on outside, indifferent and steady. Somewhere in a house not far from here, nothing had changed yet. Bills were still paid, lights still turned on, systems still ran. That was the danger of foundations. When they stop carrying weight, it doesn't show right away. I didn't check my phone. I didn't leave a message. I knew that discovery would come in its own time. Absence takes longer to register than noise. But when it does, it's impossible to ignore. As the day wore on, I felt moments of doubt try to surface. Had I been too abrupt? Should I have said something, anything? Each time the thought appeared, I examined it carefully and set it aside. Words would have softened the reality. They would have offered comfort without change. I had chosen clarity instead. By evening, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the room. I sat in the quiet and thought about the house I had left behind. It still looked solid, still felt secure to those inside it. They would move through their routines, assuming stability, assuming continuity. They wouldn't hear the silence yet. They wouldn't feel the shift. But I knew. And that was enough. That night, as I lay in a bed that didn't belong to anyone else, I felt something settle into place. Not triumph, not relief exactly, something steadier. A sense that the line had finally been drawn, not in anger, but in self-respect. I understood then that the consequences of my leaving wouldn't arrive with drama or raised voices. They would arrive quietly, the way most truths do, creeping in through cracks no one bothered to notice until it was too late. And when they did, I wouldn't be there to hold everything together anymore. The first few days after I left felt suspended, like the moment after you step off a curb and your foot hasn't touched the ground yet. Nothing collapsed. Nothing even wobbled. The world kept turning with the same quiet confidence it always had, and for a brief, dangerous moment, I wondered if I had imagined how essential my presence really was. The small apartment I'd rented was clean and spare, almost anonymous. A bed, a table, a chair by the window. I liked it that way. There were no expectations attached to the space. No habits waiting for me to resume them. In the mornings, I walked to a nearby cafe and drank my coffee slowly, watching strangers pass by, who had no idea who I was or what I'd just done. The anonymity felt strange, but it also felt honest. I didn't feel relief yet. What I felt was something closer to anticipation, though not the eager kind. More like standing outside during a storm, knowing the rain will come, but not knowing exactly when. On the fourth day, an email notification appeared on my phone while I was sitting at the small kitchen table reading the paper. It was an automated message, the kind no one ever really reads, unless something has gone wrong. A reminder about an insurance policy update. It had been sent to an address I had used for years, one Mark and Claire never paid attention to. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. For a moment, my fingers hovered over the phone muscle memory, urging me to forward the message, to add a quick note explaining what needed to be done. It would have taken less than a minute. Less than a minute to restore the illusion that nothing had changed. I put the phone face down on the table and went back to my paper. That was the first test, and it was harder than I expected. By the end of the week, there were 2 more notifications. One from a utility account I had managed quietly for years. Another from a financial service confirming a scheduled payment that no longer had a valid source attached to it. None of them were emergencies yet. They were reminders. Early warnings. The kind of signals you miss if you've grown accustomed to someone else catching them for you. I imagined how things were unfolding back at the house. Claire noticing a strange email and dismissing it as a glitch. Mark assuming I had already handled it. Their confidence would remain intact for a while longer. Stability doesn't vanish overnight, it erodes. The hardest part was resisting the urge to step back in. I had spent my entire adult life solving problems before they became visible. Letting something go unresolved felt irresponsible, almost immoral. There were moments when I questioned myself sharply, wondering if this was cruel, if I was setting them up to fail. Then I reminded myself of the dinner table, of Claire's smirk, of Mark's silence. I wasn't creating chaos. I was removing myself from a system that had come to rely on me without respect. A week later, a letter arrived in my mailbox, forwarded automatically from my old address. It was thin, unremarkable, the kind of envelope most people would toss aside unopened. I knew what it was before I opened it. A warning, not a threat. Language carefully chosen to alert without alarming. Deadlines mentioned consequences implied, but not yet enforced. I sat at my table and read it twice. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory, just confirmation. Back at the house, I knew the mood would still be casual. Claire would be busy with her own plans, her own concerns. Mark would be juggling work and family, assuming that whatever needed attention would somehow get it. The first cracks are easy to ignore because they don't interrupt your day. I began to understand something important during those quiet weeks. The systems I had maintained weren't just financial. They were psychological. I had been absorbing uncertainty so others didn't have to feel it. By stepping away, I wasn't just letting bills pile up. I was returning responsibility to where it belonged. That realization steadied me when doubt crept in. The second visible crack appeared sooner than I expected. Another letter, this one firmer in tone, less friendly. Still not catastrophic, but no longer easy to dismiss. I imagined Claire reading it with irritation, her confidence wavering just enough to register annoyance rather than concern. I could almost hear her voice saying something like, "This is ridiculous. They always mess these things up. People don't fear collapse until it has a date." I didn't call. I didn't check in. I stayed deliberately uninformed about the details unfolding in their lives, knowing that partial involvement would pull me back into the old role. Silence, I was learning, had to be complete to be effective. At night alone in my apartment, I sometimes felt the weight of what I'd done press against me. Not guilt exactly, but a deep sadness for what my family had become. I missed my grandchild's laughter. I missed the easy moments, the ones that had felt genuine before entitlement crept in. Walking away didn't erase love. It just changed how close I was willing to let it come. One afternoon, while sorting through a small stack of mail, I realized something that made me pause. None of the messages I was receiving required immediate action from me anymore. They were reminders of a role I had already relinquished. For the first time in years, my days were not organized around other people's needs. That freedom was unsettling, but it was also clarifying. The next development arrived quietly, almost politely. A notification that a policy would not renew automatically without confirmation. The language was precise, procedural, indifferent. Institutions don't care about intentions. They care about follow-through. And follow-through, I knew, had been my domain alone. I set the letter aside and went for a walk. As I moved through the neighborhood, watching other people tend to their routines, I thought about how many lives are held together by someone no one sees. A parent, a spouse, a quiet problem solver in the background. We rarely acknowledge those people until they stop. When I returned to my apartment, my phone buzzed with a missed call from a number I recognized immediately. I didn't listen to the voicemail. I didn't need to. The call itself was enough to tell me that something had shifted. Not collapsed yet, but noticed. That night I sat by the window and watched the lights come on across the street. Somewhere Claire and Mark were beginning to feel the absence, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. The safety net had loosened. The first threads were snapping quietly without drama. I felt no urge to celebrate, only a steady resolve to see this through. Because once a foundation steps away, it cannot rush back in without teaching the wrong lesson. And I knew with a certainty that surprised me again that the hardest part of all this wasn't leaving. It was staying gone long enough for the truth to surface on its own. The call came on a Tuesday morning, later than I expected. By then I had settled into a routine that belonged entirely to me. I walked the same quiet block after breakfast, brewed my coffee the way I liked it, and read the paper from front to back instead of skimming headlines between obligations. The days no longer revolved around someone else's emergencies, and that alone felt like a small revolution. I was standing by the window when my phone lit up on the table behind me. I didn't need to see the name to know who it was. The timing told me everything. I let it ring longer than necessary, not out of spite, but because I needed to be sure of something. I needed to be sure that when I answered, I wouldn't soften. I picked up on the last ring. "What is going on?" Claire demanded, her voice tight sharp with urgency she could no longer hide. She didn't bother with a greeting. Panic has no patience for manners. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch just enough to unsettle her, just enough to remind her that this conversation wasn't on her terms anymore. "Elias," she pressed, "we're getting notices. Letters. Things aren't adding up." I could hear papers shuffling in the background, the faint echo of her pacing across a room that no longer felt secure. I imagined her standing in the kitchen, the same place where she had smiled at me weeks earlier and told me to pay my own bills. The memory didn't sting the way it once had. It felt distant now, like a reference point rather than a wound. "I didn't do anything," I said calmly. "I just stopped." There was a pause on the other end, the kind that comes when someone is trying to process a sentence that doesn't fit the story they've been telling themselves. I could almost hear her recalibrating, searching for a new angle of attack. "You can't just disappear," she snapped. "This affects all of us." I said nothing. Letting her words hang where they were felt important. Finally, she lowered her voice, as if volume alone had been the problem. "We assumed... well, we thought you were still handling things. That assumption," I said, "was yours." Her breathing grew louder, faster. Panic has a way of surfacing in small sounds. A sharp inhale, a foot tapping against the floor, the brittle edge creeping into her voice. "This isn't fair," she said. "You didn't say anything. You didn't warn us." I leaned against the table and closed my eyes for a moment. Fairness had nothing to do with it, and we both knew it. Fairness would have required acknowledgement long before this call. "I didn't leave to punish anyone," I said. "I left because I understood my role, and I chose to step out of it." "That's ridiculous," she shot back. "You're family. You don't just walk away from family." I almost laughed at that, but the sound never came. Family, I had learned, was a word people reached for when they wanted access without accountability. Before I could respond, another voice entered the call. Dad Mark said, his tone cautious, strained. I could hear the effort it took for him to keep his voice steady. "We need to talk." I waited, letting him feel the weight of that sentence. He had needed to talk for a long time. Now the urgency had finally found him. "We're trying to figure out what's happening," he continued. "There are things we don't understand. Payments that didn't go through. Deadlines we didn't know about." "I'm not surprised," I said. "Those things were invisible to you before." There it was, a sharp intake of breath from Claire, a soft exhale from Mark. Truth has a way of rearranging a room even when you're not in it. "Why didn't you say something?" Mark asked. His voice wavered now, the confidence he'd inherited from Claire cracking under pressure. "If you were feeling this way, why didn't you tell us?" I considered the question carefully. It deserved an answer, but not the kind he was hoping for. "Because saying something would have changed the tone," I said, "not the structure. You would have apologized. Things might have improved for a while, and then they would have gone back to the way they were." That's not true, Claire snapped. You don't know that. I know it because it's what already happened, I replied. Over and over. The line went quiet again. I could picture Mark rubbing his forehead the way he always did when he felt overwhelmed. I could picture Claire glaring at him silently, demanding that he fix this, that he pull me back into place. Are you coming back? Mark asked finally. The question hung between us, heavy with expectation. This was the moment they had been working toward, the point where everything would snap back into alignment, where I would return quietly, take up the burden again, and restore their sense of order. No, I said. It was the simplest answer I could give, and the most honest. You can't be serious, Claire said. Her voice was trembling now, anger giving way to something closer to fear. You're just going to let everything fall apart? I'm not letting anything happen, I said. I'm not preventing it anymore. There's a difference. Mark didn't speak. In that silence, I felt something shift, something deeper than panic. This wasn't just about bills or notices anymore. This was about identity, about realizing how much of his life had been propped up by someone he had learned to overlook. Dad, he said quietly, we could really use your help. The old instinct stirred in me, familiar and powerful. The urge to step in, to fix, to smooth things over and make the discomfort disappear. I recognized it for what it was now, and that recognition gave me the strength to resist it. I've helped for years, I said gently. I'm not doing that anymore. Claire's voice rose again, sharp and defensive. So that's it. You're just washing your hands of us. I'm drawing a boundary, I replied. You can call it whatever you like. There was a long pause, and then the sound of the call ending. She hadn't said goodbye. She hadn't needed to. The conversation was over the moment I refused to re-enter the role she'd assigned me. I set the phone down and stayed where I was, listening to the quiet settle back into the room. My heart was beating faster than usual, but there was no regret in it. Only a strange mix of grief and relief, intertwined so tightly I couldn't separate them. I sat down at the table and stared at the surface for a while, noticing a small scratch in the wood I hadn't seen before. The world felt sharper, after that call more defined. The line I had drawn was real now, not just theoretical. Later that afternoon I went for a walk. The air was cool, the sky clear. People passed me on the sidewalk, lost in their own concerns, unaware of the shift that had just occurred in my life. I felt lighter than I had in years, even as sadness lingered beneath the surface. That call hadn't been the collapse. It had been the beginning of panic, the moment when denial finally gave way to urgency. I knew things would escalate from here. More calls, more pressure. Attempts to negotiate, to reframe, to pull me back in. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I wasn't managing anyone else's emotions or anticipating their need. I was standing still, holding my ground, and letting the consequences unfold without interference. As I walked back to my apartment, I understood that power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a quiet refusal, delivered calmly without anger or explanation. And once spoken, it cannot be taken back. I had avoided the appointment for as long as I could. Not because I was afraid of what I would hear, but because I knew it would make everything final. Some doors once opened don't allow you to pretend anymore. The law office sat on a quiet street lined with old trees and modest brick buildings. Nothing about it looked dramatic or imposing. That somehow made it easier to walk inside. The receptionist greeted me by name, her voice calm and professional, as if this were just another ordinary meeting. In many ways, it was. The truth rarely announces itself with spectacle. I sat across from the attorney at a simple wooden desk. He didn't rush. He didn't dramatize. He opened a folder thick with papers and placed it between us, his movements careful, deliberate. The weight of it seemed to settle into the room. Your wife prepared this years ago, he said, and updated it more than once. I felt my chest tighten, not with grief but with recognition. Eleanor had always been practical in ways I wasn't. Where I believed problems could be solved through patience and goodwill, she believed patterns mattered. She believed people revealed themselves slowly and that those revelations should be taken seriously. He slid the first document toward me. Separate accounts held solely in my name. Safeguards layered quietly into place. Property protections I had signed without much thought at the time, trusting Eleanor's judgment without fully understanding her concern. She wanted to make sure you would never be cornered, the attorney said gently, financially or otherwise. I stared at the papers, memories surfacing as I did. Eleanor at the kitchen table late at night, organizing folders, making notes. Me teasing her about being overly cautious. Her looking up at me, expression calm but firm, and saying she wasn't being cautious. She was being observant. There were notes in her handwriting clipped neatly to some of the documents. Not emotional, not accusatory, just facts, dates, behaviors, shifts in tone, patterns of entitlement, early signs of manipulation that I had brushed aside as personality differences or growing pains. Seeing them laid out like that was unsettling. Not because they were shocking, but because they were familiar. Eleanor hadn't mistrusted love. She had mistrusted what happened when respect eroded. She was worried about gradual displacement, the attorney continued. About you being eased out of decision-making while still carrying responsibility. The words landed with a dull finality. That was exactly what had happened. Slowly, quietly, without confrontation. I hadn't been pushed. I had been replaced in everything but obligation. I felt a wave of something then, not anger but a deep, steady gratitude. Eleanor had seen what I refused to see, and instead of arguing with me, she had prepared. The attorney moved on, explaining what was secure and what wasn't. Assets untouched. No shared control. No legal leverage for Claire to claim or manipulate. Everything Eleanor had set aside remained exactly where she intended it to be. For the first time since I left the house, I felt the ground beneath my feet again. I realized then how completely my family had misunderstood the situation. They believed I had walked away, exposed, vulnerable, desperate. They thought silence meant weakness. They assumed I would be forced back by necessity, by lack of options. They had been wrong on every count. As the attorney spoke, the word empire drifted into my mind, not as something grand, but as something fragile. The life Mark and Claire believed they had built wasn't supported by their own strength. It was propped up by assumptions, by my silence, by my willingness to absorb stress and responsibility without complaint. That was the real empire. And empires built on invisible labor collapse the moment that labor is withdrawn. When the meeting ended, I gathered the papers carefully and placed them back in the folder. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. The kind of resolution that comes not from victory, but from clarity. Outside, the air felt cooler, sharper. I walked slowly, letting everything settle. Eleanor's voice echoed faintly in my memory, not as sound, but as presence. She had protected me in her own quiet way long before I understood I needed it. Back at my apartment, I set the folder on the table and sat across from it, hands folded. For years, I had believed I was holding everything together out of love. Now I understood that love without boundaries had made me vulnerable to exploitation. That understanding didn't harden me. It steadied me. Later that evening, my phone buzzed with another call I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The collapse was no longer theoretical. It had a structure now, a momentum I no longer had to manage. I thought about Mark, about the confusion he must be feeling as pieces of his life shifted without warning. I felt compassion for him even now. But compassion didn't require intervention. It required honesty, and honesty sometimes meant letting someone face the consequences of their own silence. Claire, I suspected, was already scrambling. People like her sense loss of control immediately. They don't always understand it, but they feel it. Panic follows close behind. didn't celebrate that. I didn't relish it. I simply acknowledged it as inevitable. That night I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. No lists running through my head. No mental calculations about what needed to be fixed or paid or smoothed over. The burden I had carried for so long was finally set down, and my body seemed to recognize the relief before my mind fully did. In the days that followed, I noticed how differently I moved through the world. I stood straighter. I spoke less, but with more certainty. The quiet I carried now wasn't the silence of erasure. It was the silence of choice. I thought again about the house I had left behind, about the systems beginning to strain without my constant reinforcement. The collapse would accelerate now, not because I pushed it, but because I was no longer preventing it. Eleanor had known this would happen. She had prepared not for revenge, but for inevitability. For the moment when I would finally step out of the shadows and let reality do its work. As I placed the folder into a drawer and closed it, I felt something close to peace settle in my chest, not because everything was over, but because I no longer had to intervene. The empire they thought was theirs had been built on my quiet endurance, and now that endurance was gone. What remained was truth, and truth, once uncovered, doesn't need help to finish the job. I learned about the collapse in pieces, never all at once. A comment from a neighbor who still spoke to me occasionally. A forwarded email that slipped through an automated system. A clipped message from Mark that said very little and revealed far too much. I stayed distant by design, but distance doesn't mean ignorance. It means you choose not to interfere while the truth makes its way to the surface. What they called their life, what Claire once referred to with pride as everything we've built, wasn't an empire in the way people imagine one. There were no boardrooms or grand strategies. It was a lifestyle balanced delicately on predictable rescues. Overlapping payments. Quiet subsidies layered year after year. Comfort maintained by the assumption that someone else was always watching the numbers. That someone had been, without that constant reinforcement, the illusion began to thin. The first real signs were procedural, almost boring. Insurance warnings that moved from gentle reminders to firm notices. A lender requesting documentation that no one could locate. A service provider asking questions Mark had never needed to answer before. One missed support revealed several others. Claire reacted the way she always did when something threatened her sense of control. She spoke faster, louder. She blamed systems bureaucracy and incompetence. Anyone but herself. Anyone but the structure she had relied on without understanding it. I could imagine her pacing the kitchen phone pressed to her ear, explaining the situation in tones that suggested this was all a misunderstanding. Mark, on the other hand, was beginning to see the pattern. The strain showed in his voice the few times he reached out cautious and measured, as if he were testing the ground beneath him. He asked questions that hinted at confusion rather than accusation. Questions that suggested he was starting to realize how much he had never known. The word handled no longer applied to anything. Then came the discovery that shifted everything. I didn't learn about the separate accounts directly from Mark or Claire. I heard it from the attorney mentioned almost casually during a follow-up conversation. Funds moved quietly. Not illegal, not dramatic, just strategic. Money set aside, plans made without transparency, contingencies prepared that did not include me. I felt no shock when I heard it, only confirmation. Claire hadn't just grown comfortable with my support. She had planned around it. She had been preparing an exit that ensured her own safety while assuming I would continue to provide stability indefinitely. The realization reframed every interaction, every dismissive comment, every confident assumption she had made about my place in their lives. This wasn't impulsive entitlement. It was calculated. Mark found out soon after. I could tell by the change in his tone when he finally called me again. He didn't accuse. He didn't shout. He sounded tired, stripped of the certainty that had once insulated him from reality. "She's been moving money," he said quietly. For a while. I listened without interrupting, letting him say the words out loud, letting them settle. That was important. He needed to hear himself acknowledge it. I didn't know, he added, as if that might soften the blow. I believe you, I said. And I meant it. Ignorance had been his shield and his weakness. The arguments that followed between Mark and Claire were inevitable. Not explosive, not theatrical, but devastating in their own way. The kind of confrontations where voices stay controlled while trust dissolves sentence by sentence. Mark stopped asking why things had happened and started asking how long they had been happening without his knowledge. Claire panicked when control slipped. She justified. She minimized. She reframed. Manipulation thrives on confusion, and once clarity begins to form, it fights desperately to survive. I stayed out of it. The true point of no return arrived in the form of a deadline. Not an emotional one, an institutional one. A notice that required action by a specific date backed by consequences that could not be negotiated away. Mark forwarded it to me without commentary, as if hoping my involvement alone might change its outcome. I didn't respond. By then, even if I had wanted to intervene, the system wouldn't have allowed it. Too many threads had already snapped. The safety net they had relied on was gone, and what remained was exposure. Claire's confidence fractured publicly after that. Friends grew distant. Family asked uncomfortable questions. The image she had cultivated of competence and control no longer aligned with reality. Empires depend on belief as much as funding, and belief erodes quickly once doubt enters the picture. Mark reached his lowest point during that period. Exhaustion clung to him. The easy certainty he once carried had been replaced by something heavier, more honest. For the first time, he was standing inside consequences rather than watching someone else manage them. I felt compassion for him. I still do. But compassion doesn't always look like rescue. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Claire made one last attempt to reassert control, reaching out indirectly, testing boundaries, trying to rewrite the narrative in ways that painted her as overwhelmed rather than exposed. I didn't engage. Negotiation would have implied that I was still part of the structure she was trying to salvage. I wasn't. As the final pieces fell into place, I understood something clearly. The collapse wasn't dramatic because it didn't need to be. It was thorough. It was systemic. And it was irreversible. The empire they thought was theirs had already vanished by the time they recognized its absence. What they were experiencing now wasn't loss. It was reality finally unfiltered. I spent those days quietly watching my own life settle into a rhythm that no longer revolved around damage control. I cooked for myself. I walked without urgency. I read in the evenings without interruption. The contrast was stark, almost disorienting. In the past, I had mistaken responsibility for identity. I had believed that being needed was the same as being valued. Watching the collapse from a distance taught me otherwise. It showed me how easily appreciation turns into expectation, and how quickly expectation becomes entitlement. By the time the dust began to settle, there was nothing left for me to do. No roles to resume. No systems to prop up. The empire was already gone. They just hadn't accepted it yet. And for the first time in a long while, I felt no pull to return. The calls from Mark came in waves, uneven and insistent, like someone knocking on a door they were afraid to open. I watched my phone light up and go dark again on the kitchen table. Morning, afternoon, late evening. Each time I let it ring until it stopped. Not to punish him, to give him space to hear what he was already learning on his own. When I finally answered, his voice sounded different. Thinner, stripped of the casual confidence I'd heard for years. "Dad," he said. He paused as if the word itself needed permission. I think I need to tell you something." I sat down and waited. He began with details that felt small until they weren't. Statements that didn't line up. transfers he didn't recognize, explanations that changed each time he asked for them. He spoke carefully, as if afraid that naming the truth would make it real. She said it was temporary, he said, that it was just to keep things smooth, that it didn't matter. I closed my eyes and listened. I could hear the strain in his breathing, the effort it took to keep his voice steady. This wasn't a man looking for advice. This was a man watching the ground give way beneath his feet. How long, he asked the question, landing between us with a quiet finality. I don't know, I said honestly, but long enough. There was a silence, then the kind that doesn't need filling. I imagined him sitting at the edge of his bed papers, spread out in front of him, replaying years of conversations with a new understanding. Moments that once felt settled, now reassembling themselves into something far less comfortable. I didn't see it, he said. I should have. I didn't correct him. This wasn't the moment for blame. It was the moment for clarity. She planned for herself. He continued, words tumbling faster now. Accounts, backup plans, things she never mentioned. And all this time I thought we were on the same page. I let him speak until the words slowed, until the anger softened into something heavier. Grief, maybe, or disbelief. Betrayal has many stages, and recognition is the most painful of them. What do you want from me? I asked gently. He hesitated. I could hear it in the way his breath caught. I don't know, he admitted. I needed you to know. I needed to say it out loud. That more than anything told me how far he'd come. The confrontation between him and Claire happened soon after. I wasn't there to witness it, but I didn't need to be. Mark told me later, his voice flat, almost distant, as if recounting a storm he had barely survived. There was no shouting, he said. No broken dishes or slammed doors, just long, exhausting conversations that circled the same truths again and again. Claire minimized. She justified. She insisted it was all meant to protect them, to keep their life intact. Mark listened, not as a partner this time, but as someone hearing a familiar story with unfamiliar ears. He stopped asking why she had done it. He started asking how long she had been willing to let him remain ignorant. That shift changed everything. She said you wouldn't mind, he told me quietly. That you'd understand. That you'd always step in. The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they were accurate. I had always stepped in. I had taught them that I would. I felt the old instinct rise, then the urge to explain myself, to defend my silence, to list the reasons I had done what I'd done. I let it pass. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about Mark seeing the truth of his own life without my interference. I won't fix this, I said after a moment. And I won't take sides. I know, he replied. And for the first time, his acceptance felt genuine. Claire's panic intensified as Mark pulled away. Control, once loosened, doesn't vanish quietly. She tried pressure first, then emotion. Tears, accusations, rewriting history to make herself the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of them. Mark resisted in ways he never had before. He asked for transparency. He demanded explanations that made sense. She couldn't give them. The marriage didn't end in a single dramatic moment. It fractured over days, then weeks, each crack widening as trust failed to return. The man who had once relied on silence to keep the peace now found his voice, and he used it not to attack, but to question. I watched this unfold from a distance, careful not to step into the space he was finally occupying himself. It would have been easy to say, I warned you. I saw this coming. I had every reason to. I said none of it. One evening, Mark called again. His voice was tired, but steadier than before. I don't think we're going to make it, he said. Not with drama, not with bitterness, just with resignation. I'm sorry, I replied. And I meant it not as an apology, but as acknowledgement of the loss. I keep thinking about that night at the table, he continued. About what she said to you, and what I didn't say. I waited. I thought staying quiet would keep things from getting worse, he said. I didn't realize it was already making them worse. That was the moment I had been waiting for, though I hadn't known it at the time. Not for vindication, but for understanding. I stayed quiet for a long time too, I said. For the same reason. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was softer. I see that now. After that, the calls slowed. Not because things were resolved, but because Mark was learning to stand without leaning on me. He made decisions, some of them painful. He faced consequences without asking me to absorb them. Watching him do that stirred a complicated mix of pride and sorrow in me. Claire's attempts to pull me back in continued briefly. Indirect messages, comments passed through other people, questions framed as concern. I ignored them all. Engagement would have blurred the lines Mark was finally drawing for himself. By the time the separation became inevitable, it felt less like an ending and more like an acknowledgement. The marriage had been hollowed out long before it broke apart. All that remained was the act of naming it. Mark didn't ask me to intervene. He didn't ask me to rescue him from the fallout. He told me what he had decided and asked only that I listen. I did. When we hung up that last call, I sat quietly for a long time, thinking about how much had changed without me lifting a finger. The truth had done its work on its own. Silence, once used to diminish me, had finally given my son the space to see clearly. The marriage was over. That much was certain. But something else had ended too, something older and heavier. The cycle of quiet enabling, the assumption that I would always be there to make things easier. As I stood and turned off the light, I felt the weight of that understanding settle in my chest. Not with triumph, with acceptance. The truth had finally found its way to the surface, and this time I hadn't had to carry it alone. Everything began to move at once after that, as if some unseen switch had been flipped. Problems that had once arrived one at a time now came in clusters, overlapping and unforgiving. The kind of pressure that doesn't give you space to breathe, let alone plan. I didn't need to be there to know it. The signs reached me anyway. A forwarded notice from Mark sent without comment. A message from a mutual acquaintance who didn't know what to say, but felt compelled to say something. Even the tone of Mark's voice when he did call carried the weight of someone running out of places to stand. Collapse. I learned doesn't happen slowly at the end. It happens all at once. The financial break was the first undeniable blow. What had once been warnings became actions. Coverage lapsed. Credit tightened. Deadlines passed without extensions. Institutions are not sentimental. They don't care about good intentions or family history. They care about compliance. And compliance had depended on me far more than anyone realized. Mark told me about the foreclosure notice in a voice stripped of emotion, as if saying it out loud required him to distance himself from it. He didn't ask what to do. He didn't ask for help. He simply stated the facts one by one, as if organizing them might make them less real. I didn't think it would go this far, he said quietly. It always does, I replied. Not as a judgment, as an observation. The damage didn't stop at money. Reputation followed closely behind. Claire had built her sense of authority on the image of control of competence. When that image cracked, people noticed. Friends grew cautious. Conversations shifted. Invitations slowed. The same confidence that had once drawn admiration now invited scrutiny. Empires, even small ones, depend on belief as much as funding. Once belief erodes, everything accelerates. Mark reached his lowest point during that stretch. I could hear it in the pauses between his words, in the way exhaustion flattened his voice. He wasn't defending Claire anymore. He wasn't trying to hold the story together. He was simply trying to survive the fallout. I felt compassion for him then, stronger than ever. Compassion without interference, love without rescue. It was a difficult balance, but it was the only one that allowed him to grow. Claire, on the other hand, made one last attempt to regain control. It wasn't direct. It came through suggestion, through implication. A message passed along by someone else. A comment framed as concern. The familiar pattern of pressure wrapped in politeness. I didn't respond. Engaging would have implied that I was still part of the system she was trying to salvage. I wasn't. And even if I had wanted to step back in, the structure no longer allowed it. Too many doors had closed. Too many consequences were already in motion. The precise moment it became irreversible arrived quietly. A legal deadline crossed, a notice finalized, a decision made by someone else with the authority to enforce it. No appeals left, no resets available. Mark didn't call me right away after that. When he finally did, it wasn't to ask for anything. It was to tell me he understood now what I had meant when I said I wasn't letting anything happen. I was simply no longer preventing it. "I get it," he said. "Even if you'd stayed, this would have happened eventually." That was the truth I had been waiting for him to reach on his own. By then, the word empire had lost whatever dramatic weight it once held. It wasn't power or wealth that had collapsed. It was dependence disguised as success. A life built on the quiet assumption that someone else would always absorb the strain. I spent those days in my own steady rhythm. Morning walks, simple meals, long afternoons without interruption. The contrast between my calm and their chaos wasn't something I took pleasure in. It was simply evidence of how misaligned my life had become before I left. I thought often about how close I had come to staying, how easily I could have convinced myself that enduring a little longer was the responsible thing to do. How many people live their entire lives that way, mistaking endurance for virtue until there's nothing left of themselves. One evening, Mark came by unannounced. He looked thinner, older somehow, the easy confidence he once wore replaced by something more grounded and real. We sat across from each other at my small table, the space between us filled with things that didn't need to be said. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," he said after a while. "I just wanted to see you." I nodded. That alone told me how much had changed. We talked quietly about practical matters, about the future, about the difficult choices he was making. He didn't ask for approval. He didn't ask for permission. He was learning finally to stand in the discomfort rather than escape it. When he left, I felt a complicated mix of sorrow and pride. The collapse had cost him dearly, but it had also given him something I had failed to teach him before: accountability. As for Claire, her world narrowed quickly once the structures supporting it fell away. Control once lost is difficult to fake. The confidence she had wielded so easily no longer held. Consequences have a way of clarifying character, and clarity is rarely comfortable. I didn't follow her story closely. I didn't need to. The outcome was no longer my responsibility. By the time the dust settled, there was nothing left to salvage. No empire to rebuild, no illusion worth restoring. What remained was truth laid bare and a series of lives adjusting to it in different ways. I stood by my window one night, watching the lights across the street flicker on, thinking about how quietly everything had ended. No dramatic confrontation, no shouted vindication, just the slow, inevitable collapse of something that had never been as solid as it appeared. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Finished carrying what wasn't mine to carry. Finished being the invisible support no one acknowledged. Finished mistaking silence for peace when it had only ever been erasure. The fall was complete. Not because I pushed it, but because I stepped away and let reality take its course. And in that stillness afterward, I understood something that had taken me 70 years to learn. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to fight for what you've built. It's to stop holding up what was never truly yours. The quiet that followed the collapse felt heavier than the chaos that came before it. No more frantic calls. No more messages laced with urgency or accusation. The noise had burned itself out, leaving behind a stillness that forced everything to settle where it truly belonged. I noticed it first in my mornings. I woke without a knot in my chest, without the instinctive scan of problems waiting to be solved. The apartment was small, but it was mine in a way nothing had been for years. I chose when to open the curtains. I chose how long to sit with my coffee before the day began. No one expected anything from me simply because I existed in the same space. For a long time, I just sat with that freedom, unsure what to do with it. I had spent decades measuring my worth by how much I could carry without complaint. Responsibilities had stacked quietly, one on top of another, until they formed the shape of my identity. Without them, I felt exposed at first, like a structure stripped down to its frame. It took time to realize that what I was feeling wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space to breathe. Space to think. Space to decide who I was when I wasn't needed as a solution. My days took on a rhythm that surprised me with its gentleness. Morning walks through the neighborhood when the air was still cool. Simple meals cooked slowly without distraction. Afternoons spent reading books I had set aside years ago, because someone else always needed something first. Evenings that belonged entirely to me. There was relief in it, but there was also grief. I missed my grandchild more than I allowed myself to say out loud. I missed the easy moments that had once felt genuine before entitlement crept in and hollowed them out. Love doesn't disappear just because boundaries are drawn. It lingers reshaped, learning how to exist without self-erasure. Some nights the sadness came quietly settling beside me like an old companion. I didn't push it away. I let it sit. Grief, I was learning, wasn't a sign that I'd made the wrong choice. It was proof that I had cared deeply. What surprised me most was how quickly my body responded to the change. The tension I'd carried in my shoulders eased. My sleep deepened. The constant low-grade anxiety that had hummed beneath everything I did faded into something almost unfamiliar. Peace, I realized, is not the absence of conflict. It's the absence of obligation that costs you yourself. I began spending time with people again, but differently this time. Not as a provider, not as a fixer, just as a man showing up because he wanted to be there. Conversations felt lighter when I wasn't calculating what they might require of me later. I listened more. I spoke less. And when I did speak, I noticed that my words carried more weight because they weren't diluted by constant compromise. Through a local community group, I started volunteering a few afternoons a week. Nothing dramatic. Helping older adults understand paperwork budgets, the small traps that catch people who trust too easily or give too much. I never framed it as a warning. I framed it as information. Knowledge offered freely without obligation. I saw myself in many of them. People who had spent their lives being dependable, generous, quiet. People who mistook endurance for virtue because that's what they were taught, watching their faces shift as they realized they weren't selfish for wanting boundaries. Stirred something deep in me. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't angry. I was resolved. Mark checked in occasionally, but our conversations were different now. Shorter, more honest. He didn't ask me to intervene. He didn't ask me to take sides. He told me about the decisions he was making, the mistakes he was learning from the weight he was finally carrying on his own shoulders. I listened. That was enough. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful apologies meant to restore the past, and that was exactly what made our connection feel real again. It wasn't built on obligation or guilt. It was built on mutual respect, still fragile, still forming, but honest. As for Claire, she remained distant, her presence reduced to an echo in conversations that no longer centered on her. I didn't wonder how she was doing. I didn't track her setbacks or her recoveries. Letting go meant letting go fully, without the need to monitor the consequences. I understood now that walking away wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about refusing to participate in my own erosion. One afternoon, while organizing my small bookshelf, I found the old notebook Eleanor used to keep. The one filled with lists and observations written in her precise handwriting. I sat on the floor and flipped through it slowly, not to reopen wounds, but to honor her clarity. She had seen this coming. Not the specifics, but the pattern. She had known that love without boundaries becomes a slow disappearance. And she had loved me enough to protect the part of me I hadn't protected myself. I closed the notebook and felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. Not sorrow. Gratitude. For the first time since her death, I felt like I was living a life she would have wanted for me. One that didn't require me to shrink to be included. One that allowed me to age with dignity instead of quiet resentment. The question people kept asking, when they asked at all, was why I never went back, why I didn't try to rebuild what had fallen apart. They said it gently, as if returning were the natural conclusion. They didn't understand that going back would have meant returning to a version of myself that no longer existed. I hadn't rebuilt my old life. I had built a new one. Smaller, quieter, but infinitely more honest. A life where my value wasn't measured by what I paid for, or fixed or absorbed in silence. A life where I could choose generosity instead of being trapped by it. Late one evening, as the sun dipped low and cast warm light across the room, I sat by the window and thought about how far I'd come without ever raising my voice. No confrontation. No revenge in the way people usually imagine it. Just a decision made and upheld. The world hadn't ended when I stopped holding everything together. It had simply rearranged itself around the truth, and for the first time in a long while, that truth felt like something I could live with. People still ask me why I never went back. They ask it gently, as if returning were the obvious conclusion, the missing final step that would make the story sit more comfortably in their minds. They assume leaving was an emotional reaction, something temporary, something that time would soften. I always pause before answering because the truth isn't sharp or dramatic. It's quiet, and it took me a long time to understand it myself. I didn't go back because going back would have meant pretending nothing had changed. It would have meant stepping into the same shape I had occupied for years, the one that fit everyone else's needs so neatly, while slowly erasing my own. Apologies might have been offered. Promises might have been made. For a while, things might even have felt better. But the structure would have remained the same. I didn't leave out of anger. Anger burns fast and fades just as quickly. What carried me away from that house was clarity. Once you see the truth of how you are being used, you can't unsee it. And once you understand that silence has been mistaken for consent, the only honest response is to remove that consent entirely. People like to call what I did revenge. I understand why. From the outside, it looks like I walked away and everything collapsed behind me. But revenge implies action. It implies intent to destroy. That was never my goal. I didn't break anything. I stopped holding it together. There is a difference, and it matters. Revenge is loud. It wants witnesses. It wants the other person to know they are being punished. What I did was quieter than that. I withdrew my time, my money, my attention, and my silence. I stopped smoothing over problems that weren't mine to solve. I stopped absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to feel it. What happened after that wasn't cruelty. It was gravity. For most of my life, I believed love meant endurance. That if you could just take a little more, give a little longer, things would eventually balance out. I believed that being needed was proof of being valued. Those beliefs were passed down to me, reinforced by a world that praises sacrifice and calls it virtue. But sacrifice without respect isn't noble. It's corrosive. It took me 70 years to understand that dignity isn't something you earn by suffering quietly. It's something you protect by choosing yourself when no one else will. Walking away didn't erase my love for my son or my grandchild. It simply drew a line around the part of me that still mattered. I think often about that dinner table, about the moment everything crystallized. Claire's sneer, Mark's silence, the casual way my presence was reduced to a joke. That man stayed quiet because he believed peace was more important than himself. The man writing this stayed quiet for a different reason. Silence can be submission, but it can also be strength. The difference lies in who chooses it. When I stopped intervening, the consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as truth. Systems that relied on me revealed themselves. Relationships that depended on my silence showed their real shape. My son, forced to face reality without a buffer, finally learned what responsibility felt like. Painful as that was, it was also necessary. And I learned something too. I learned that leaving doesn't make you heartless. It makes you honest. It means you are no longer willing to participate in your own erosion just to keep others comfortable. It means you understand that love offered freely is very different from love extracted through guilt and expectation. Today, my life is smaller in ways that matter and larger in ways that don't show on paper. I wake up without dread. I choose where my energy goes. I help people who ask for guidance without letting myself be consumed by their needs. I give because I want to, not because I'm afraid of what will happen if I don't. And I am at peace with the fact that I never went back. If you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, you're not alone. Many people, especially later in life, find themselves quietly holding everything together while being taken for granted. They're praised for being strong, dependable, selfless. But no one asks what it's costing them. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not weak for wanting boundaries. You are not selfish for stepping back. And you are not cruel for choosing yourself when no one else will. Sometimes the most powerful act isn't confrontation. It isn't revenge. It's withdrawal. It's the decision to stop propping up a life that only works when you disappear inside it. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been the quiet one, holding everything together? Have you ever had to walk away to protect your dignity? Share your experience in the comments. These stories matter, and you never know who might feel less alone because you spoke up. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about justice, boundaries, and finding your strength when the world expects your silence, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel and take a moment to like this story so it can reach others who might need it too. Sometimes silence is power, but only when it's chosen.